down the rabbit hole, and into the shadows. We all think we know the story. A curious girl, a white rabbit, a sudden fall into a world that seems delightfully absurd. Talking flowers, grinning cats, a tea party stuck in time. For generations, Alice in Wonderland has been sold to us as pure whimsy. A harmless dreamscape where logic bends and consequences vanish. A place you visit, enjoy, and leave unchanged. But pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered why this particular fantasy has lingered for more than 150 years? Why it still unsettles adults long after children have stopped being afraid of fairy tales? Why certain moments in the story, the disappearing cat, the Hatter's frozen clock, the Queen's shrill commands, feel strangely familiar, as if they belong not in a dream, but in a memory? Here's the first twist. What if Wonderland was never just a fantasy at all? What if the rabbit hole wasn't an escape from reality, but a descent into a truth Victorian England didn't dare speak aloud? Because once you pull back that velvet curtain of Victorian decency, once you stop looking at Wonderland as a child and start looking as an adult, something unexpected happens. The bright colors fade, shapes sharpen, the nonsense starts making sense. And instead of a dream, you see a mirror polished by a society obsessed with appearances. A mirror that reflects the things Victorians hid under layers of lace and etiquette. A mirror Lewis Carroll held up quietly, almost defiantly, in the guise of a bedtime story. And here's the unsettling part. The deeper you lean in, the more the reflection seems to stare back. A story born on the water. Or was it? The official version sounds almost too perfect. A warm afternoon in July of 1862. A rowing boat drifting along the River Thames. Light flickering on the water. A shy mathematics lecturer named Charles Dodgson, better known to the world as Lewis Carroll, sits with 3 young girls, the daughters of the Little family. They laugh, they ask questions, and eventually, one of them demands a story. The middle child, Alice, is 10 years old, restless, sharp, already full of opinions. She insists on something strange, something wild, and Dodgson obliges. He begins spinning a tale, right there on the river, about a curious girl who follows a white rabbit into a world where nothing makes sense, a world that would later enchant readers everywhere. That's the origin story. Polished, innocent, the kind of memory you'd frame in gold and hang on the nursery wall. But what if that river carried something deeper? Something no one wanted to surface? Because decades later, when Dodgson died in 1898, that idyllic version began to unravel. His family opened his personal diaries, not the published works, but the raw notebooks he kept by hand. And what they did next has haunted literary scholars ever since. They removed pages. Not a sentence, not a paragraph, entire pages, gone without a trace, and not just any pages, the ones that covered the summer of 1863, the ones that documented the height of his friendship with the little children, especially Alice. The very period when Wonderland was being born. Why? We don't know. We may never know. The pages weren't archived or preserved. They weren't quoted or explained. Some say they were burned in the fireplace. Others believe they were quietly hidden. But either way, they vanished. And with them, any chance of truly understanding what happened on that river. The family never spoke of it. No public statement, no clarification, only silence. As if silence could smooth over the cuts. But here's the truth no editor can erase. When someone removes part of a story, that missing space becomes its own kind of message. What was written on those pages? And why did the people who loved him decide the world should never read them? The silence in the study. Picture it with me for a moment. A dim, narrow room in an Oxford house, the kind where the air always smells faintly of ink and old paper. Heavy curtains drawn halfway, letting in just enough light to reveal the dust floating in the stillness. A study frozen in time, Dodgson's study, where he wrote letters no one was meant to read and stories the whole world eventually would. His sisters stand around the large oak desk, the one scarred with years of use. They are grieving, tired, speaking in low voices. Someone opens a drawer, Inside lie several leather-bound journals, their spines cracked from constant handling. These are not the polished diaries he shared with friends. These are his private notebooks, the ones he never expected to be read aloud. One sister begins to leaf through the pages. Another hovers beside her, arms folded tightly, as if bracing for something she already fears. They turn page after page until the room seems to hold its breath. And then, she stops. Her fingers freeze on an entry dated June 27, 1863. She reads it silently. Her expression changes. First confusion, then shock, then something even harder to name, a kind of quiet horror maybe, or recognition, or both. She presses her lips together as if trying to swallow whatever she has just learned. No one speaks. No one needs to. A moment later, almost without thinking, she reaches for the desk drawer again, but this time, she pulls out scissors. The metal glints in the weak afternoon light. Another sister gasps, barely audible, but doesn't stop her. The first snip slices through the silence. Paper tears. Another snip. Another page removed. Then another. The sound is strangely violent in a room so still. The sisters work quickly now, as if afraid someone might walk in and ask questions they aren't prepared to answer. Page after page is cut away with surgical precision, leaving only ragged stubs. A lifetime of thoughts, gone in minutes. Some say the pages were tossed directly into the fireplace, curling into black ash before anyone else could see them. Others whisper they were hidden, locked in a family drawer, sealed away with the intention that no child or scholar should ever uncover them. Either way, they disappeared, and the house never spoke of it again. But here's the question that lingers, like smoke that refuses to fade. What could possibly have been written there, in Dodgson's own hand, that made his family decide the world should never see it? And why did they believe that silence was safer than truth? Dodgson and his muses. Charles Dodgson, the quiet Oxford Don, who would one day sign his name as Lewis Carroll, lived a life that, on the surface, seemed perfectly ordinary. He was a lecturer in mathematics, a man of routine, of stammered speech and stiff collars. By day, he taught logic and algebra. By night, he walked the cloisters of Christ Church in silence. To many, he was simply another eccentric scholar among many. But behind that respectable exterior was a pattern, one that even his contemporaries noticed, though few dared speak of it aloud. Dodgson was fascinated by little girls. He spent a remarkable amount of time with them, specifically between the ages of 6 and 12. He invited them to tea. He sketched them in his notebooks. He photographed them, often posed in costumes, princesses, beggars, flower fairies, even sometimes in classical drapery or suggestive allegorical scenes. He wrote them long, elaborate letters filled with pet names, riddles, inside jokes, and in more than one case, he created entire private fantasy worlds just for them, with rules, maps, and characters based on their lives. To the girls, it may have felt magical, to the parents, flattering. But to us, looking back through a darker lens of history, it raises uncomfortable questions. Over the years, some biographers have described these relationships in gentle terms, calling the girls his muses, or emphasizing the supposed purity of Victorian sentiment. Others have gone further, asking bluntly what Dodgson's intentions really were. Was it all innocent? Was it obsession? Was it something more disturbing, carefully hidden beneath the layers of manners and metaphors? The truth is, we don't know, and perhaps that's the most haunting part of all, because those missing diary pages, the ones torn out and possibly burned, might have held the answers, might have revealed what he truly felt, what he truly feared, and what lines may or may not have been crossed. But without them, we're left with fragments, photographs that feel too composed, letters that are too intimate, friendships that lasted just a little too long, and ended just a little too suddenly. We're left, in other words, not with facts, but with shadows. Long, stretching shadows that follow the story of Alice wherever it goes, and the deeper we follow those shadows, the more they seem to lead not through a dreamland, but through the carefully curtained parlors of Victorian England, where silence was often the safest form of protection, a gift for one, then a warning for all. Before Alice's Adventures in Wonderland became a cultural monument, it was something far smaller, far more intimate. The very first version wasn't meant for bookshops, critics, or the wide Victorian public. It was a private creation, a handwritten manuscript Dodgson crafted by lamplight, page by page, for one little girl, Alice Little. Imagine that original book, not yet bound in glossy covers, not yet illustrated by professional engravers. Instead, a slim manuscript filled with Dodgson's delicate penmanship, tiny sketches curling into the margins, playful references only Alice herself would understand, inside jokes from boat rides, little riddles they had shared, innocent moments preserved in ink. It was, in essence, a secret gift, a Christmas present meant to delight a child and no one else, a story for one pair of eyes. But something remarkable and unsettling happened when Dodgson made the decision to publish the tale for the wider world. He didn't simply tidy up the manuscript and add a few chapters. He transformed it. The public version wasn't just longer, it was darker, considerably darker. Scenes that feel iconic today. The baby turning into a pig, the grin that lingers long after the Cheshire Cat's body disappears, the Mad Hatter caught in a loop of frozen time. None of these existed in the gift version, not one. He added them deliberately, thoughtfully, almost surgically. And here's where the story tilts. Why would a man expand a gentle children's tale into something so strange, so unsettling, even occasionally frightening? Why inject shadows where there had only been sunlight? Because at some point, the project had shifted. Wonderland was no longer a private amusement meant for a single child. It had become a vessel, a mirror, a coded critique of Victorian society, disguised in nonsense so that only those willing to look closely would see it. The more Dodgson rewrote, the more the whimsy thinned, and something sharper emerged beneath. The randomness, the chaos, the violence, the transformations. They were no longer just imaginative fantasy. They were commentary, the pig baby that shrinks into itself, a reflection of the neglected children of industrial England, the Cheshire Cat's permanent smile, a mask worn by a society obsessed with propriety while hiding its discomforts beneath the surface, the Hatter stuck at 6 o'clock forever, a portrait of workers trapped in endless, mind-numbing labor under conditions that eroded both body and mind. The private story had become a public warning. And here's the real twist. The darker the story became, the more, strangely, the public adored it. Perhaps because beneath all the whimsy, they recognized something they lived with every day. Wonderland was no longer a playground. It was a whisper, and Dodgson knew exactly what and who he was whispering about. Growing tall on liquid dreams. It's one of the most iconic moments in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. The girl, confused but curious, finds a bottle labeled "Drink Me." She takes a sip. Her body begins to shrink. Later, another taste, and she grows impossibly tall. Limbs stretch, the ceiling looms, the floor drops away. To modern readers, it feels surreal, playful, almost cartoonish. To the psychedelic crowd of the 1960s, it looked like a metaphor for altered states of consciousness. But for readers in Carol's own time, that scene may have felt far more familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. Because in Victorian England, the idea of a mysterious liquid changing your child's body wasn't a fantasy. It was daily life. By the middle of the 19th century, opium, particularly in the form of laudanum, was present in almost every household across Britain. It came in glass bottles with elegant labels. It was sweetened with syrup or alcohol, sometimes both. It was sold freely without prescription. And it was marketed as a cure for nearly everything: headaches, coughs, indigestion, anxiety, bad nerves, toothaches, and most disturbingly of all, for babies who cried too much. There was no shame in buying it. In fact, there were ads encouraging it. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup became one of the most successful patent medicines of the age. It promised mothers relief from sleepless nights and quiet, content infants. The branding was gentle, the language maternal, the warnings non-existent. What the ads didn't say was that each bottle contained enough morphine sulfate to sedate or silence an adult, and the babies were smaller, much smaller. By the early 1850s, coroners across London and Manchester began reporting a disturbing trend. Rows of tiny bodies, pale and motionless, lined up in poorhouse morgues. Most had no bruises, no visible illness, only a common pattern: shallow breathing, blue lips, and traces of syrup still clinging to their mouths. Doctors called it accidental suffocation, infant fatigue. But everyone knew these were laudanum deaths, death by quiet. In 1854, a woman named Sarah Whitfield testified at an inquest in Southwark. She worked 16 hours a day at a textile mill and gave her 6-month-old son a spoonful of Godfrey's cordial, another opium-based syrup, each night before she left. It helped him sleep, until one night he didn't wake up. His tiny lungs had simply stopped. And yet, sales continued. Bottles remained on mantles, advertisements stayed in newspapers. Society looked the other way, because no one wanted to ask the harder question: what kind of world forces a mother to choose between survival and silence? Which brings us back to Wonderland. Alice sips a strange potion and her body transforms. She feels out of place, too big, too small, too wrong. The world around her becomes unrecognizable. Her identity slips, her voice shrinks. She becomes unmanageable. It reads like fantasy until you remember the children who also drank from ornate little bottles, who shrank not into storybook creatures, but into silence, and whose transformation was not temporary. The Victorians didn't need fantasy to imagine the horror of a bottle that changes a child. They had it on the shelf. So when Carroll wrote about potions that twist the body and erase control, maybe he wasn't playing. Maybe he was remembering, or warning, a pig-nosed baby and a quiet horror. It's one of the strangest scenes in Alice's adventures in Wonderland. A red-faced infant sneezing and snorting in a chaotic kitchen, slowly morphing into a pig. For generations, readers have laughed at the absurdity of it. A bit of whimsical nonsense, a surreal joke in a world where logic has no place. But Carroll rarely invented his oddities from thin air. And once you look at the medical records of Victorian England, that scene stops being funny. It becomes something else entirely. Because the truth is, babies really did transform. Victorian doctors had a term for them: opium infants. Children so thoroughly dosed with laudanum that their bodies began to change in ways that sound disturbingly like Carroll's fictional pig baby. Doctors in the 1850s and 1860s described the symptoms again and again: skin that sagged unnaturally over tiny bones, faces that seemed to collapse inward, eyes that lost their brightness, arms and legs that grew thin and stiff, and most eerily of all, noses that flattened or curled downward as the facial muscles weakened. In 1856, a physician in Manchester wrote a line that still chills historians today. They resemble little old men. Imagine being a Victorian mother, working impossible hours, exhausted, desperate for your baby to sleep through the night. You reach for a teaspoon of laudanum, the same syrup everyone else uses. You believe it harmless, you believe it normal, but over weeks and months, your baby quiets, slows, shrinks. Their cheeks fall in, their breathing shallows, their tiny face starts to look less like a child's, and more like something aged, drained, unnatural, and no one around you questions it. No doctor, no neighbor, no shopkeeper selling the syrup, because this was the Victorian secret everyone knew and pretended not to see. Now go back to Carroll's Duchess holding her snorting, writhing child, a baby already caught in a grotesque transformation. A nose shifting into a snout, eyes shrinking, body curling, a creature turning into something it should never be. Was Carroll exaggerating? Yes, but was he inventing? Perhaps not. The parallel is almost too sharp to overlook. That pig baby wasn't just absurdity for absurdity's sake. It was a mirror held up to a society quietly harming its own children. hiding the horror behind pretty bottles and comforting labels. Carol wrapped the scream in nonsense so thick that Victorian readers wouldn't flinch. Or maybe so they would if they dared to look twice. Wonderland, in that moment, stops being playful. It becomes a warning disguised as a joke, a truth so unsettling that it had to be masked in fantasy. And once you see the pig baby through Victorian eyes, it's very hard to unsee. The Mad Hatter wasn't just mad. We say it without thinking. Mad as a hatter. It sounds quirky, old-fashioned, a harmless phrase from another time. But in the England of the 19th century, it wasn't just a colorful idiom. It was something much colder, much crueler. It was a medical reality. Hat-making back then was a toxic profession, quite literally. To stiffen felt, the core material of fashionable gentlemen's hats, workers used mercury nitrate. It helped bind rabbit or beaver fur into a dense, smooth fabric. But there was a catch. The chemical process released mercury vapor, invisible, odorless, deadly, and the workers breathed it in. Every day, for years. At first, the signs were subtle. A slight tremor in the hands, a bit of memory loss, a stammer that hadn't been there before. But over time, the damage spread. Muscles began to twitch. Speech became slurred. Emotions frayed. Hallucinations crept in. By the time symptoms became obvious, it was usually too late. The nervous system had already begun to collapse. Doctors started calling it Hatter's shakes. Others had a crueler name for it, mercurial madness. Imagine a factory floor in Stockport or Luton around the year 1860. Rows of men bent over felting tables, their faces pale, their hands trembling so violently they could barely hold a needle. Some whisper to themselves. Others start talking to things that aren't there. One man bursts out laughing at nothing at all. Another breaks into sobs mid-shift and has no idea why. And here's the part that's hardest to accept. Everyone knew. The factory owners knew. The doctors knew. The government knew. Even the workers knew, in hushed, exhausted tones. But nothing changed. Because these were working-class men. Replaceable, invisible. Their health came second to productivity. Mercury use in hat-making wasn't banned in Britain until 1941. And even then, not for health reasons. It happened only because the military needed mercury for detonators during the Second World War. Until then, generation after generation of hatters slowly lost their minds under factory roofs, while society smiled and tipped its cap. And Lewis Carroll? He knew too. Oxford wasn't far from those industrial towns. He would have read the newspaper reports, heard the testimonies, known the symptoms. So when he sat down to write a riddle-loving man trapped at a tea table, frozen in endless time, locked in nonsense. It wasn't pure invention. It was remembrance. It was protest. It was grief in disguise. The Hatter wasn't just a funny man in a funny hat. He was a eulogy for the workers no one mourned, for the minds that broke in silence, for the laughter that masked something darker underneath. So the next time you hear mad as a hatter, remember, it didn't start as a joke. It started with poison, painting over the blood. At first glance, it feels absurd. 3 playing card gardeners panic under the Queen's gaze, hastily painting white roses red. It's comical, childish, the kind of surreal moment that defines Wonderland's charm. To modern readers, it might seem like harmless nonsense, just another piece of Carroll's imaginative chaos. But Victorian readers, they saw something else, something far older and far bloodier. Because in England, red and white roses weren't just flowers. They were banners of war, the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict that ripped through the heart of England in the 15th century. Was not a single war, but a series of brutal struggles for the throne between the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, whose emblem was the white. Between the years 1377 and 1487, the throne changed hands repeatedly. Kings were crowned, kings were murdered, armies marched under floral symbols that, over time, came to mean far more than loyalty. They meant life or death. In the year 1461, during the Battle of Towton, fought in a snowstorm on Palm Sunday, over 28,000 Englishmen lost their lives in a single day. it remains the bloodiest day in English history. Some soldiers were cut down mid-prayer. Others froze where they fell. The snow turned crimson and then black. And here's the terrifying detail. Some of those men were killed not for what they had done, but for what they wore. A rose, red or white, pinned to a tunic could decide your fate. On the wrong day, in the wrong town, even a sympathizer's flower could get you dragged from sanctuary and executed in the street. At Tewkesbury in 1471, Lancaster supporters who had taken shelter inside an abbey were pulled from the altar and beheaded in the churchyard. Blood ran down the steps of a sacred place. This was history Victorians knew. Their parents and grandparents had passed down these tales of betrayal, of civil chaos, of thrones soaked in blood. They had seen paintings, read school books, walked through villages where graves still bore the names of men lost to a war about colors. So when Carroll showed gardeners desperately trying to repaint white roses red, frantically correcting the color to match the Queen's preference, his readers understood. This wasn't just whimsy, it was compliance under threat. Because in England, failing to display the right rose wasn't just a mistake, it was treason. And the Queen of Hearts, shrieking, "Off with their heads," at the slightest offense, didn't feel so exaggerated. To readers raised on tales of Henry VIII's executions, or Elizabeth I's spies, or the countless anonymous dead of York and Lancaster, her fury felt uncomfortably familiar. Carroll's satire was sharper than it appeared. He knew his audience would see the blood beneath the paint. He trusted them to recognize the real history behind the joke, because behind every absurd rose in Wonderland was a real one, once pinned to a real chest. And behind every ridiculous execution order from the Queen was a very real echo of power, arbitrary and absolute. Wonderland wasn't mocking tyranny, it was reenacting it, the classroom that broke the child. Before he was an author, Charles Dodgson was a teacher, and not just in name. He lectured in mathematics at Oxford for over 25 years. He spent countless hours inside dim lecture halls, watching rows of stiff-backed students recite facts they barely understood, their minds dulled by repetition. He saw it from the inside, the machinery of Victorian education, and it troubled him deeply. Because Victorian schooling wasn't built to spark curiosity, it was built to control it. Children were not taught to ask questions. They were taught to memorize answers, preferably in verse. Rote learning was the law of the land. Students were drilled on moral poems, historical dates, geographical facts, mathematical tables, not to understand them, but to repeat them back perfectly, without hesitation and without error. Discipline replaced dialogue. Punishment replaced wonder. Now picture young Alice wandering through Wonderland with her well-behaved mind. She's polite, eager to recite what she's been taught. She tries to apply the rules she knows, multiplication tables, moral lessons, polite conversation, to a world where none of them work. And what happens? They fall apart. 4 times 5 is 12, she declares proudly. Then, 4 times 6 is 13. She tries to remember a poem, and the words shift into nonsense halfway through. She's confused, embarrassed, lost. Everything she's memorized starts to betray her. At first, it seems like Carroll is mocking Alice, but he's not. He's showing us what happens when a child raised on obedience walks into a world that demands understanding. And here's the secret. Alice's math isn't wrong. Not entirely. Carroll, ever the trickster and mathematician, had embedded a quiet joke. In an alternate number system called base 18, 4 times 5 really is 12. It's a layered, brilliant puzzle, invisible to children, amusing to scholars, and sharply critical to those paying attention. Because underneath the wordplay is a pointed message. Victorian schools weren't creating thinkers. They were producing repeaters, children who could recite stanzas and tables with mechanical precision, but couldn't adapt, question, or imagine alternatives. The moment the structure changed, their knowledge collapsed. So did their confidence. And in Wonderland, that collapse becomes literal. Alice, the model student, begins to question her own identity. Who in the world am I, she wonders. Ah, that's the great puzzle. It's not just a moment of whimsy. It's a psychological unraveling. Because if everything you've been taught fails you, what remains? Carroll wasn't just criticizing education. He was warning about what happens when we confuse conformity with intelligence. In Wonderland, the classroom follows the child. The poems don't teach. The math doesn't help. And the lessons, once a source of pride, become riddles she can't solve. And isn't that the real madness? A world where knowledge exists, but doesn't mean anything. The trial, where nothing makes sense. By the end of her journey, Alice finds herself in a courtroom, though that word hardly applies. The judge is a king, the prosecutor is a cook. The jury writes nonsense before the trial even begins. Witnesses contradict themselves or speak in riddles. Evidence appears to be made up on the spot. Logic is mocked, order is non-existent, and presiding over it all is the Queen of Hearts, snarling her favorite verdict before a word is said. Off with their heads. It feels like satire, absurd, a farcical finale to a surreal adventure. But Carroll wasn't inventing chaos. He was transcribing it. Because Victorian justice, especially for the poor, often looked just like this. Let's step out of Wonderland and into London, the year 1856. A woman named Mary Barrett, a seamstress from Whitechapel, is brought before a magistrate. Her crime? Stealing a loaf of bread. She has 3 children at home. She hasn't eaten in 2 days. She was caught with the loaf in her apron. She admits it, quietly, without resistance. There is no defense lawyer, no appeal. The sentence is swift: 6 months of hard labor in Newgate prison. She will not survive it. Within 3 weeks, Mary is dead from typhus. Her children are sent to the workhouse. Now look at the very same court, just a few days later. Augustus Fitzhugh, a young man of noble birth, is accused of assaulting his housemaid so violently that she's unable to work for a month. There are multiple witnesses. The maid herself appears in court, bruised, weeping. The magistrate listens, sighs, and delivers his judgment. A fine of £1, less than the cost of the champagne Augustus drank with breakfast. He walks out smiling. No prison, no record. Just a polite warning to conduct himself as a gentleman. And the newspapers barely mention it. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. The Victorian legal system prided itself on being rational, orderly, civilized. But in practice, it was deeply theatrical. A stage where class decided outcome, where respectability could erase violence, and desperation was treated like deviance, where justice looked very different depending on the hat you wore, or the color of your hands. Now return to Wonderland. Alice stands in the courtroom and watches the same nonsense unfold. Facts don't matter. Power overrides everything. The queen screams, the crowd cheers, the trial becomes performance. But Carroll wasn't mocking fairy tale logic. He was holding up a mirror. The courtroom wasn't a joke. It was a reflection of the world his readers lived in every day. A world where fairness was an illusion and verdicts were pre-written long before the accused ever spoke. So when Alice finally rises, frustrated, clear-eyed, defiant, and says, "You're nothing but a pack of cards," she isn't just dismissing imaginary characters. She's doing what no Victorian defendant was allowed to do. She's calling out the lie. What lies beneath the smiles. We remember Alice in Wonderland for the whimsy, for the talking rabbits, the vanishing cats, the riddles with no answers, for the tea parties that never end and the logic that constantly slips through your fingers. It feels playful, dreamlike, harmless. But stories don't survive for over 150 years because they're harmless. They survive because they say something no one dares to say out loud. And Carroll's book, Behind the Jokes, Behind the Nonsense, is whispering constantly. It's whispering about children trained to memorize instead of understand, about women told to smile instead of speak, about workers poisoned slowly, invisibly, while everyone pretended not to notice, about courts where the sentence is decided before the trial even begins, about a world where to question power or simply fail to flatter it could cost you your head. Every absurd scene is a disguise. Every riddle is a warning. Wonderland wasn't meant to distract us from reality. It was meant to expose it. And through it all, in the middle of the madness, stands a little girl, proper, polite, trained to obey. But slowly, as the world unravels around her, something begins to shift. She asks questions, she doubts, she sees through the masks, and finally, in the moment that matters most, she refuses to play along. She looks at the queen, at the courtiers, at the whole ridiculous theater of power, and she says the words no one else dares to speak. You're nothing but a pack of cards. Not royalty, not gods, not untouchable, just paper, painted lies, easily blown away by breath or truth. It's the most powerful moment in the entire book. And it comes not from an army, not from a king, not from a rebellion. It comes from a child who sees clearly, a girl who finally learns that the world is not always fair and not always kind, but that seeing it for what it truly is the first step toward escaping it. The real magic trick. Lewis Carroll was a master of wordplay, yes, but that wasn't his greatest trick. His true genius lay in something far more subversive: disguise. He didn't write a fantasy, he wrote a message, sharpened, deliberate, and dangerous. Then he wrapped it in riddles, tucked it inside tea parties, and placed it gently in the hands of children. A story that looked like nonsense, but knew exactly what it was doing. Because A,